Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Parsha is V'etchanan, and Moses pleads with God to cross the Jordan into the Promised Land. God, on the other hand, is cross with Moses. When should we ask for more? When do we ask for too much? That is the question. So puff off your chest and join us for enough, or as they say in Israel, die, maspeak kvar. Well, welcome. Rabbi, you are in Beersheba about to officiate at a wedding, and it is the 15th of Av, which, as you mentioned in the pre-show, is the Valentine's Day of the ancient, mentioned in the Talmud. So what a special day it is for you. Thank you so much for being able to join with us.
Wouldn't miss it, and this is a great parsha, and you chose a really good topic, so let's get going.
Great. So, as I said in the introduction, this is V'etchanan, and we start in Deuteronomy 3:23. And again, it's written in the first person because it is the book of the Devarim, and it's straight from Moses' mouth. And it says, V'etchanan el Hashem, I pleaded with God at that time, saying, O Lord God, you who let your servants see the first work of your greatness, of your mighty hand, you whose powerful deeds no God in heaven or on earth can equal. Let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan. In the Hebrew it says, E'ebrana, cross over. And on the other side of the Jordan is Be'ever HaYarden. But God was wrathful, v'hita'aver Hashem bi, on account and would not listen to me. God said to me, enough, never speak to me of this matter again. And he tells him to go up onto the mountaintop, look at it well, for you shall not cross yonder the Jordan. Give Joshua his instructions, imbue with him strength and courage, for he shall go across the head of his people, and he shall allot to them the land that you may only see. So you mentioned this last week as a prime example of Moses talking in the first person, pleading with God. And here we are, and as you could tell from the Hebrew that I threw in, I was totally struck by one word that was used over and over again. The easiest form it was used was Be'ever HaYarden, which means on the other side of the Jordan. But also, if you notice when Moses asked to cross over, he says, E'ebaratna, let me cross over. And then, what I never thought of before, when God was cross, and it's interesting that in English, the word for cross can mean to transverse, and it can also mean to be upset. And in Hebrew, lo and behold, the same thing occurs. When God is mad at Moses, it says, V'te'aver Hashem bi. So were you struck by this as well? Have you given this any thought?
I have not. That is absolutely fantastic. I never thought about that the word vayit aber and Ever HaYarden are exactly the same word. And to be cross and to cross is the same. Now, obviously, it makes sense to be cross with somebody, to be angry at someone, is to go over to the other side. We assume that you're supposed to be friendly. So if you're not friendly, you cross over to not being friendly. So I understand the etymology, but that's great to find it at the beginning of this week's parsha. I love that.
Well, and of course, while I had never really associated it with being angry, we have associated it with sinning. Aveira is when you transgress the law, when you cross the boundary, so to speak.
Exactly. Exactly the same idea.
Let's focus a little bit more on this Aveira, on this over, on passing over. And of course, I mentioned that it associated with sin, but it is also associated with being a Jew, an Ivri, or I should say a Hebrew. It is, the Hebrew word is Ivri, Hivri, Hebrew. And as far back as Genesis, when it, in Lech Lecha, it says, Ve'ayavo Avraham ba'aretz ad makom Shechem, it uses this term. And in Genesis 14, when Abraham is talking to the kings, it says, Ve'yavo palit ve'yaged la'Avram ha'ivri. And it came to Abraham the Ivri, the one who had passed over, the one who had provoked to anger, maybe, the one who had transgressed the norms of the past. So this is really, it's not just a moment where Moses can't pass into the land. It's a moment that Moses can't be his version of Abraham, in a sense. It's very profound.
And just we'll add one last example of that, the fact that Ivri, the one from the other side, is the way that, the Jews define themselves at critical moments when Jews is trying to run away from God, and he gets on the ship and they don't know who he is, and he says, Ivri Anochi. He says, I am from the other side. Means that at critical moments, that's the way we define ourselves, that we're different. And it's so interesting that that's true to this very day, is that, our differentness is something that helps identify us.
Yeah. And I think this sense of anger that I discovered in this week's Parsha, how does that relate to Ivri, to a Hebrew? To me, it resonates as a provocateur. To me, it resonates as someone who can provoke anger, because again, he seems to be passing over the boundaries. He seems to be going to a place that was maybe taboo. How do you package all of them together?
I think that's good. I would just say, I think in literature, they say that sometimes a word is used, even though it's not a full use of the word, to remind us of something else. And I think that's what you picked up. The word for God getting angry at Moses is vayitaber, because the Torah wants us to do exactly what we're doing today on Clubhouse. And that is think about all the ways in which Ivri defines the Jews. Ivri nochi, Aver Hayardain. So it's successful. Means vayitaber is not a usual word for getting angry. The Torah knows the word ka'as. The Torah knows the simple word for getting angry. But the Torah chooses not to use it because the Torah wants to sensitize us to the idea of all the things that we're talking about, which is great, I think.
And you find this a lot. It's almost the poetic, using the same shoresh over and over again in a literary element, and making you think along the lines that we are. So I totally agree. So now that we've kind of focused on the Ivri part of it, maybe we can focus a little bit on something that last week I said, maybe I'm going to do a podcast on this next year. But lo and behold, here we are. I mean, we know this concept of Rav Lechem has haunted Moses for quite some while. So Rav Lechem here means, God says, enough. Never speak to me of this matter again. His Vayomer Hashem Elai Rav Lecha al Tosif Daber Elai Od B'Davar Hazeh. And we know that when Korach led his rebellion, in Numbers 16 is the first time that we came across this expression. And it's when the members of the tribe of Levi had said to Moses and Aaron, presumptively because they had taken leadership positions, they said, Rav Lechem ki kol ha'eder kulam kadoshim. You you have gone too far. You've done a power grab. And then a few verses later, Moses returns to them and says, you, Korach, and all your brand, take fire pans tomorrow, put fire in them and lay incense on them before God. Then the candidate whom God chooses, he shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi. Rav lachem b'nei Levi. So they are trading this barb at each other of Rav lachem, and I almost feel like we're outside of a private joke at this point. And I'll go on to mention what prompted me last week in Deuteronomy 1:6. Moses is beginning his first person sermon to the people, and he says, and when you were at Mount Sinai, when you were at Horeb, and God spoke to you, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Rav lachem shevet bahar hazeh. And then he goes on because he's talking to them about all of the different trips they took, all of the different transfers and stops they made in the 40 years in the desert. And in Deuteronomy 2:3, he says, you have been skirting this hill country long enough. Now turn north. Rav lachem sov el hahar. So are we outside of a private joke here, or am I just plucking this out of the air?
No, but I think you started at the beginning in your introduction by saying that we still say in Hebrew, die or maspik kvar. The idea is enough. That's the way we respond when people overstep their bounds. Now, in the Torah is really all about bounds, because the Torah is about God's relationship with people. And God has certain boundaries. And when you pass over those boundaries, then you've broken the rule. And what God says to you is too much. So Korach was too much. You pass God's boundary. Moshe this week is too much. You pass God's boundary. Now, sometimes you don't know what too much is. You can't fault Moshe. He wanted to enter the land. And, God gets angry at him, says, enough is enough. I don't want to hear about it anymore. But if you can't fault Moses for trying.
Well, not at all. And I think part of the subtext of today's discussion is, when do you need to try? When do you overstep the bounds? When are you supposed to be patient? And when are you supposed to be impatient? And you picked up on the colloquial expressions in modern day Hebrew. I think they always say about the Eskimos, they have at least 10 words for ice. I think in Israel, they probably have 10 expressions for impatience. Israel is...
That's the most important thing is they actually can say it without words. When they put their first finger and their thumb together, that's also saying like enough, right?
It's absolutely true. And as I looked it up, it's masbikvar and die, and it's kvar maspik. It's so much part of the Middle Eastern, or certainly the Israeli mentality. They are impatient. It speaks to this sense of they want to get on with it, and it's not so much the power grabbing thing as it is, and that's why I was happy to quote those other verses from last week's Parsha, where Moses twice uses Rav lachem in a sense of move on already. You've been at Mount Sinai enough. Move on. You've wandered in the desert long enough. Move on. So it is power grabbing, but it's also maybe the status quo, grabbing that and not moving on. And it totally relates to Ivri, to someone who passes over the boundaries, to someone who passes over the river and moves from one country, from one reality to another. You can't disconnect the two. They're almost the flip side of each other.
I think that's right. And I think it's really interesting. It's funny because what you said was that the Eskimos have 11 words for ice and we have 11 words for enough. But the Torah same word again and again. Rav, right? The Torah could have said it in different ways, but the Torah wants us to connect all these different places in which God says enough is enough. And it's interesting that it's also used within the idea of move on, means enough, means, you need to move forward, enough standing still, enough paralysis. I think we say that also, right? Get on. I think our phrase is get on with your life is really the same thing, right? Enough, get on with your life.
So I totally agree. I started to quote the Sifrei Bamidbar that Rashi quotes, and I think the first explanation that he gives for Rav Lachem, I began talking about it, was the difference between a private prayer and a public prayer. I think that related a little bit to this original use of the term against that Korach used. You've taken too much power into yourself. You're too into yourself. You're asking for something for you to move into the new land. God listens to prayers, but he listens to prayers of the group, of humanity, of the whole people. And this thing is enough for you. You've asked for too much. But it goes on and it gives at least two or three other explanations for Rav Lachem. One of them was much for you. He said to him, much reward is in keeping for you, much is stored away from you, quoting Psalms 31:12. So here it's not so much putting Moses down as saying, you have enough already. You can cash in your chips. You can bank the commandments, the mitzvot that you have done. Maybe leave it for somebody else, but certainly you've finished your mission. Do you think there's an element of that here?
I think the entire book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, has a lot of that. God saying it's time to leave it for the next generation. Enough, Moshe, your time is over. I think that's all over the place. And I think this is really the first place that you see it. It's interesting. We talked last week about the fact that Moshe speaks in the first person in the book of Devarim. Actually, the parsha last week was more or less just Moshe's narrative, Moshe's story. The first time that we have a conversation between God and Moshe in the first person of Moshe is here at the beginning of Va'et Hanan. So this is actually it's an important moment, because now Moshe tells you what his relationship is with God from his perspective, not from God's perspective. And he must have been frustrated because all he wants to do is enter the land, and what God says to him is enough. Right? That must have been so frustrating for Moshe. I actually saw, Geoffrey, an interesting thing today. Why is it that Moshe wanted to enter the land? It's a funny question, because you say the land of Israel, everybody wants to go to the land of Israel. But what was it that Moshe wanted in the land of Israel? Did he want the Holy Land? Did he want to be the leader? Did he not want to give up the leadership? There are a lot of different pieces of Moses, and it's hard to know exactly what Moshe thought was most important in his desire to continue.
I think we can all conjecture, and maybe we'll get into it a little bit later, but certainly he wanted more. Continuing on with the Sifrei, another much for you, Rav Lachem, he said to him, much have you labored, much have you toiled, take leave, Moses, and rest. It's almost, we have the oldest president in the history of the United States, and there are those that are saying, Rav Lachem, Joe, it's time. It's time for another generation.
It's so funny. It's so funny you say that, and you see that Joe Biden doesn't want to accept that. It's very hard to be told as you get older, enough is enough, that you need to leave room for the next generation.
Absolutely. Another interesting thing is, I don't think it's happened lately. In Israel, it happens more often, where you can be a prime minister, and then in the next government, you can just be a minister. You can go down. I think it's maybe in the early days of our country, you had someone like a Thomas Jefferson who would be a president, and then he might become a senator. But the other thing that the Sifrei brings is that Moses says, "Look, I'll even go into the promised lands and I'll work for Joshua.
As a commoner.
I'll work for
Right,
Joshua."
that'll be a commoner.
So the Lord says, "Rav Lecha." The station of Rav is yours. It does not befit a Rav to become the disciple of his disciple. So this is kind of interesting because here you are, Rabbi, you are a Rav. And the rabbis of the Talmud saw in the word Rav truly a Rav, a master, and the master can't serve the disciple. But that is also kind of interesting. It reminds me of another expression in the Talmud, Ma'alin behegdish ve'ein moridin. You can take something up in holiness, but you can't bring it down. What do you read on this, and what's your...
I love that Sifrei because it's kind of a joke. Because in the Torah, the word Rav doesn't mean rabbi. That's a rabbinic word. We all know that. Rabbis were invented by the rabbis. Rabbis were invented by the Talmud. Moses is never called a rabbi until the rabbis later refer to him by Moshe Rabbeinu. So when the Medrash, when the Sifra plays on the word Rav and says it means, rabbi, it's the sense that I would even work for Joshua. So it's actually just a kind of a funny play. It's not what the Torah actually means, but it's kind of the rabbinic interpretation. And, the rabbis to play with the words of the Torah. They know that it's not what the Torah means, but they still like to play with the words of it.
And I'm sure that there would be easy enough to make a case for the clergy grab here. That one of the things I think that distinguishes Judaism from so many other religions is that as much as we admire our rabbis, they can't be counted for more than one person of a minyan. They can't do anything more than any simple Jew. They are admired for their leadership skills. They're admired for their knowledge, but it's not as though they can do communion and no one else can do communion. And that is Rav Lachem. The rabbi cannot take any more power. That's kind of unique. I don't think that's embedded in this comment, but it's certainly an interesting insight.
That is definitely an interesting insight. That's great. So the Sifra has us going in a whole different direction, which is really what the Medrash does so often, is it allows you to kind of develop a completely different idea here.
So I think after we go through all of the Midrashic interpretations and others, we still come back to the fact that we are all allotted a certain amount of time on this blessed earth. And beyond that expiration date is Rav Lachem. Enough. You're only given so much, whether it's, you should take a rest now or you can cash your chips now. But this concept that I don't think anyone has really said any better in modern times than Martin Luther King Jr., I've been to the mountaintop. The metaphor of this is as far as you get, and I know you just want to cross the Jordan and get into the promised land, but that might not be allotted to you, and that certainly is not a ruler of your success in life. I think that ultimately, has to be the most basic message here. I think of it in Pirkei Avot 2:16, with Rabbi Tarfon used to say, "It is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it. Lo alecha hamelacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin levatel mimenu." Would you say that's the basic message here?
That is the basic message. And the rabbis in that line, and obviously that's the most famous line of all, I think they really summarize all of the things we're talking about here. And that's what God is saying to Moshe. I mean, it happens to be that the book of Devarim all took place in the last 30 days of Moses' life. So he doesn't have much to do. So v'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena, there isn't much left for Moshe to do other than to make sure that the transition of leadership is going to go smoothly. And as we move on in Devarim, we're going to see that actually is an issue, that they're worried about that. How are the people going to accept Joshua? What's that going to look like? What's that transition going to look like? It's interesting. We always say that, and when we have presidents, so the transition is planned because, one president wins and one president loses and you move on. But when you have leaders like kings and queens, that, when the leadership moves on, when somebody dies, it's very difficult because it's hard to prepare for it. And I'm sure we all know that, they've literally have spent 30 years preparing for the Queen's death. Means they know exactly what's going to happen when Queen Elizabeth dies. Even if it's 20 years from now, they know exactly, because it's very hard to have transition of leadership when you can't prepare for that transition, when you don't know when it's going to happen.
Absolutely. We're almost coming to the end, given you've got to go to the wedding. And I promised that we'd spend some time talking about Beersheba. And the segue that I want to give is actually another word that is related to Ma'avar, to Passover, and that is Ma'abarot, transit camps. And when the Jews, especially from the countries in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and for those of you who are listening, there's so much that's said about Israel being colonized by people coming out of Eastern Europe. We forget, until we go to a place like Beersheba, how many Jews from Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Morocco settled in the land of Israel, returned to Israel because they were being persecuted. But it was started by the elite Ashkenazi Eastern European Jews. And what happened typically, and this is a story you can either confirm or deny, Rabbi, but this is what I heard when I visited Beersheba. And that is when the Jews from Morocco got to Israel and they got to the buses taking them to the different locations, they all wanted to go to Jerusalem. And so there were buses marked Jerusalem. They got on, they woke up in the morning, and guess what? They weren't in their promised land. They were in Beersheba. And it seemed to me, and they also went into transit camps, Ma'aberot. And from that, we know that you don't pass over the Jordan immediately, that it's a process. And sometimes it takes one generation, and sometimes it takes multi-generations. And what I was thinking, and we'd love to hear from you about this, is how Beersheba, which was started by immigrants who many cases were not that sophisticated and were put in the backlands of Israel, so to speak, have, through multi-generations, not that first one, created something beautiful down there. So give us an update.
So I think that's a great segue. So I'll just say quickly that we all know that Jews lived in Middle Eastern countries. Morocco is just one of them, but Libya and Iraq and Iran. And what happened was that starting after 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, the Jews didn't feel comfortable in these Arab countries. And therefore, many of them came to Beersheba. They were not sophisticated. We look at everything through our eyes. They weren't sophisticated in kind of the intellectual Western sense of being, I've gone to college and being professionals. They were traders. They opened shops. And that's what Beersheba looked like for a long time. There were people who lived in Beersheba. Actually, when Sadat came to Israel in 1979, he came to visit Beersheba. Means it was a significant city even then. What turned Beersheba around was in 1969. They opened a university in Beersheba. And all of a sudden, the intellectuals started coming to Beersheba. It's interesting that there were many American professors who made Aliyah and started teaching Ben Gurion. It was hard for an American professor to get a job in Israel in the 1970s because the university jobs were taken by Israelis. These were foreigners. They couldn't compete with the Israelis. But Ben Gurion University was a new university. They were looking for impressive professors. So you had all these fancy professors from the United States who moved to Beersheba. And you actually have, and this is what you have now, you have this amazing melding together of a university community, and it's now one of the top universities, one of the top medical schools. They have a great hospital here, and there are, there's high tech here, and there's development, and there are buildings. And I went to a swimming pool today. It's hot. You have to go swimming during the day, and it was fantastic to see the people there, and everybody was together. You had the Ashkenazim, Eastern European, with the Middle Eastern people, and they've really developed an amazing community here. And what you see the way people lived when they came in the 50s and 60s. You see small little houses, and then you see the big tall apartment buildings you were talking about. It kind of looks like some of the buildings, Geoffrey, look like suburban Tel Aviv, don't they? It's just great down here. And it's also interesting the way, we kind of forget this, but the way people are sensitized here because it's so hot. There still is that tradition in Beersheba that if you walk in the shuk, and every city has a wonderful shuk, if you walk in the shuk in Beersheba between like 1 and 4 in the afternoon, many of the stores are still closed. Meaning it's hot during the day. They go home, they eat lunch, and they take a nap. They take a siesta, and they come back at 4 o'clock when it's a little cooler. So they've really developed an amazing culture here, and this is now the gateway to the south in Israel. What's happened in Israel, and I know, Geoffrey, that your work takes you even south than Beersheba. What's happened is that there are cities and towns that have developed beyond Beersheba. So now you say it's really a gateway to the south, and they actually call Ben Gurion the University of the Negev. It's not just Beersheba University, it's the University of the Negev. So it's a very exciting city. I kind of would tell people when they come to Israel, and I fault myself too, I haven't been in Beersheba for a long time. That is a mistake. Sharon and I are going to come to Beersheba to visit. It's really important to understand Israel, to see Beersheba. Like you said, there are different types of places. You go to old kibbutzim, you go to small new development towns, but this is a city. This was to see what happened. And I'll just end by saying that the Torah, of course, introduces Beersheba. Beersheba was a place where Abraham, and Avimelech, who was the king of Gerar, who was the king of one of the neighboring countries, they made a pact here to get along. And probably the word Beersheba, it's a trick. Sheva means 7. But probably the word Beersheba means that they made a shavua. They took an oath around the well. And it's amazing that this is the city, how, so many thousands of years later, that actually is a city where different kinds of people can come together and can live together. So we maintain that tradition of Abraham and it's, there's a religious community here and there's a secular community here, and it seemed like, I don't know why, but it seemed like all the Moroccan restaurants in the shuk today were all kosher. In Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, you have to ask whether they're kosher. In Beersheba, every single thing seemed to be kosher, which I thought was kind of fun. So that's nice. So I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Geoffrey, this was great today. I'm happy that I was able to make time because this was a really, really good one today. This is a Shabbat. It's called Shabbat Nachamu. It's a Shabbat of consolation after Tisha B'Av. So we should all have a time. The last weekend was a weekend in Israel. There actually were rockets and sirens here in Beersheba. But please God, it should be a time of nachamu, of consolation and comfort and good things. And everybody should enjoy the summer, Geoffrey. And I look forward next week being back on New York time, 8 o'clock Thursday night. Looking forward to seeing everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi Adam. We feel like we're part of your simcha, and I just want to say that this episode is dedicated to the beautiful town of Beersheba, and I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.